And without further ado, I'm really going to introduce our first speaker. So the first speaker is Alex Callinicos. Alex is Professor of European Studies at King's College, but far more importantly, he is the editor of our very fine journal, International Socialism, which of course has been the host for today's event. So, Alex.
Thanks very much. When I was setting out this morning, I suddenly remembered something that the great Palestinian writer Edward Said said in a discussion, I think sometime in the early 1990s. He said that for him, the question of identity was totally uninteresting, and that what mattered for him was the question of emancipation. Now, I think there's an important truth in what he said, but I want to qualify it. And the reason why I want to qualify it is because there's a widespread tendency on both the right but also the left to treat class and identity as two separate things. I mean, maybe you find a framework in which they're all fitted together as part of different factors that divide people and so on and so forth, but they're treated as separate. And as I said, you find this on the left. So there's a man called Walter Ben Michaels, an American academic, who about 10 years ago wrote an article which was called Against Diversity. Anyone who works in a university, or probably in the public sector, knows that that's like heresy, because diversity is something that we're supposed institutionally to be very strongly committed to. And what Michaels said was essentially that capitalism is colourblind and gender-blind. It'll use anyone, whatever their race, whatever their gender and gender identity or whatever, for its purposes. And therefore, to talk about identity is a diversion from the real question of addressing class and exploitation and so on. Now, I think it's clear from what we've discussed today that sometimes identity is a diversion and can turn people in on themselves, but sometimes the assertion of identity is an essential step towards emancipation. For Said's own Palestinian people, defining themselves as a people was absolutely crucial when, for example, Golda Meir, as Israeli foreign minister and prime minister in the 60s and 70s, denied that there were anyone called Palestinians. If you think about the contemporary struggles of trans people, then simply defining themselves as trans is absolutely crucial. So I think when we approach the question of identity, we need to look at whether particular identities, asserting them, promote or impede the struggle for what Marx called universal emancipation. Now, but approaching that question in a more concrete way involves understanding that class and the different forms of oppression that are often tied up with identity are inseparably connected. They can't be counterposed. And I want to focus particularly on the question of racial oppression. There's a book that I wrote a long time ago, back in the early 1990s, called Race and Class. And although I wrote it a long time ago, I think its fundamental claim is correct, which is that racism isn't something universal, it isn't something eternal, it isn't something inherent in human nature, it is a product of capitalism. It arose as part of the process through which capitalism developed and entrenched itself globally. And more particularly, it arose specifically to justify plantation slavery in the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries. And of course, I think we probably all understand that the development of plantation slavery was a critical step in the whole process of global capitalist development, the development of industries like sugar, later on at that crucial to the Industrial Revolution, the development of a cotton industry based upon slavery in the southern United States. And but to understand what's going on properly, we have to ask the question, is why does it matter so much under capitalism to be able to define some people as inherently inferior? Because capitalism wasn't the first-class society. We've had exploitation and hierarchy and inequality and oppression, unfortunately, going on for thousands of years. But there was something distinctive about capitalism, which is that, unlike in previous forms of class society, let's say feudalism, exploiter and exploited were defined as unequal. The lord was superior to the peasant in society. But capitalism says something quite different. Capitalism offers the promise of at least formal equality. Marx shows this in the first volume of Capital, where he analyzes the transaction, the exchange between the worker and the capitalist, where the worker sells her labor power to the capitalist and ends up being exploited. But Marx says at the level of the exchange, the transaction, worker and capitalist are equal. They're both commodity owners, they're legally equal, they're both citizens. So there's this formal equality that capitalism presupposes, and doesn't just presuppose, it puts it on its banner. Think of the American Declaration of 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, despite the sexist limitation. A magnificent statement, but does anyone know who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was not just an early president of the United States, he was a major Virginia slaveholder. So you have this contradiction. We promise equality and freedom for all and so on, but we deny that to some people whom we enslave. And the way to make the two things fit together was to say that black people, the African plantation slaves, were inherently inferior to the white slave owners who were exploiting them. Now, one interesting thing is that the development of racism and ideology has often been a defensive exercise. So if you read Peter Fryer's great book about the history of black people in this country, he shows how it was when people start to criticize the slave system in the West Indies that ideologues like Edward Long started to write detailed treatises trying to prove that black people were inherently inferior. And I'm just reading a very interesting book by the African-American academic Henry Louis Gates called Stony the Road. And it's about the experience of Reconstruction. In other words, the period after the Civil War, when the South has been militarily defeated, as it being occupied by the North. And the radical wing of Lincoln's Republican Party are forcing through legislation which enfranchises black people and allows lots of black people to be elected to Congress and as governors and senators and God knows what else. And there's this massive counter-revolution that is carried through to reverse Reconstruction and impose a new system of segregation, again on the basis of formal constitutional equality between black and white, which had been won as a result of the Civil War, the Jim Crow system that prevailed till the Civil Rights Movement developed in the 1950s and 1960s. And the ideology of scientific racism develops in the United States as part of this counter-revolutionary struggle in order to re-establish a form of racial domination in the southern United States, to reverse and crush Reconstruction. But it's very important to understand that, of course, racism isn't just about domination. It isn't just about subordinating people to the exploiters and their agents, usually white, but not always only white. It's also about division. If we look at modern capitalism, as it's developed in the last couple of centuries, it's a global system that can only run on the basis of a working class that is itself global, is itself international. And the international character of the working class is partly reflected in the fact that that working class is formed by wave after wave of migration. You know, we talk about, you know, stupid commentators say, oh, this is the great age of migration. But if you look at how American capitalism was formed in the 19th century. If you look at the Industrial Revolution in this country, if you look at what happens, the great flows, huge flows of people, not simply from Europe to the Americas, but from different parts of Asia, from India and China to work in the colonial empires, you see that migration is an endemic part of capitalism. And it carries the potential for a working class that is international in its sap, in its essence. In other words, it doesn't just exist in different countries, but its formation within individual countries reflects, in a certain sense, the entire world, thanks to migration. But also, because there's economic competition among workers, and because, of course, migrant workers are brought in to do dirty, low-paid jobs. Because of this, there's always the potential that migration can divide different sections of the working class against each other. People say many stupid things about Marx, like that he wasn't interested in the question of racism. He understood it very well. There are these magnificent letters that he wrote at the end of the 1860s and the beginning of the 1870s, in the wake of the American Civil War, where he had played a role in rallying the international working class movement to support the North in crushing the slave power in the South. And he says, now the working class movement in Britain has to fight to support Irish independence. And he says, this isn't a moral question. It isn't a question of justice or rights. It's a matter of survival. Because he says the British working class is divided between native British workers and the Irish migrant workers. And it's very important to understand, partly because it teaches us the lesson that racism isn't necessarily about colour, that Irish workers coming as cheap labour, doing the heavy physical jobs that literally built Victorian Britain, built Industrial Revolution Britain, and who came from what was effectively a British colony at the time, were represented in the most vile racist terms throughout 19th and indeed into 20th century Britain. This was a racist division inside the working class. And Marx says this is the hidden secret of the impotence of the British working class. Unless it overcomes that division, it will never become a revolutionary subject capable of overthrowing capitalism. And therefore, the British working class movement has to be in the forefront for the struggle for Irish independence. Now, you take that argument, it applies with modifications to where we are at the present time. If we want to get rid of capitalism, which is the engine of racism, then we need a united international working class fighting across borders. The only way we can do that is by fighting racism. In other words, a working class that thinks it can just fight on economic issues, even on questions as profoundly important as resisting austerity, will not win. It has to take up the question of racism. It has to fight racism. Now, as in the past, in the form of increasingly vicious anti-migrant racisms that particularly are legitimized through Islamophobia, the key racism of the present time. That is the enemy that we have to confront today. Now, this is a conference organized by International Socialism. Since we were founded in 1960, we have consistently campaigned against racism and against immigration controls. You can find the beginnings of Paul Foot's classic book about race and immigration in Britain in the early numbers of International Socialism. So this is something that is part of the very essence of us as a journal and of the international socialist tradition of which we're part with the Socialist Workers' Party. So this is the fight that we have to conduct today. This is the most important area of struggle that we find ourselves in today. And we bring to it a Marxist tradition which has identified the importance of fighting racism in the heyday of the founders of that tradition.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alex. And as Alex ended on the note about our journal, International Socialism, those of you that are not aware, the current issue is showing here on display, and it is also available on the stalls outside. This is a quarterly journal that comes out. In the current issue, we have two very important articles that speak directly to the themes here, one on fascism in Europe and the rising tide of this, and the other one on Marx and race and Eurocentrism. But there are also articles in there on struggles in Latin America, as well as the debates on the ongoing crisis of the Tories and Brexit, as well as other lots of goodies. You can also sign up for a subscription. Please see people outside on the stalls afterwards. Selma, we're very pleased that she's able to be here. She is an anti-racist activist in France and also a member of the Anti-Capitalist Party over there. Some of you that might have been in a session earlier on would have heard her speak, but we're very fortunate that she's going to be able to address everyone that's attended the conference today. So please welcome Selma.
So the issue we have in France is that there is actually on one side there is a very strong workerist culture. The most caricatural example was when Lutte Ouvrière was discussing over the European elections. We've been having a debate as the NPA. We invited Lutte Ouvrière to discuss our common points and differences. And finally, the speaker said something very shocking, which is the worker who works at McDonald's who's threatened to be sacked doesn't care about the migrants' camp who is just close to its working place. So you have this view of there is one side anti-racism and which has no class value, and the other side, the workers. And the problem we have with this definition is that it is, by not saying it, it is showing a view of, a nationalist view of what the working class is, of people who are French. So the non-French are not working class, and the non-whites are not working class. And this is something also that's been also challenged within historical examples, but also within the movements. One of the strong example the anti-racist left has been using was the strike back in the early 80s. So you had workers in a factory who staged a strike. Those workers who staged a strike at the Talbot-Poissy at the Talbot-Poissy factory were mostly non-whites because they have the most the lower jobs were mostly for Maghrebis, Arabs, and so they staged a strike to get equal pay. And the bosses tried to mobilize against them because they were organized in a trade union. But you had also, the bosses set up a scab trade union to break the strike. And this scab union to break the strike was based on very nationalist basis and very racist. The media has been saying that this strike is an Ayatollah strike. So they've been already, since the 80s, using Islamophobia to demonize working class movements. And one of what happened is that the scab bosses, trade union by the white people who's been working in the factory, started to attack those workers, and they attacked them physically, and there is a video that shows what they've been saying. They've been saying like, Arabs go to the oven. So it is a reminder of how anti-Semitic also this national consensus is being built. And so another element also was the 2004 law to ban Muslim girls from going to schools. It is also an attack on the working class as well, but it was not seen as such. It happened also after historical movement, but also a defeat over a pension strike. And so what was left among the education sector who's been targeted over austerity measures was to stage an attack on veiled women. And at the same time, those women was at schools were also emerging politically. So it was also a way to block the political emergence of migrants and children of migrants who came to school and may play a role into I would say the working sector. So the systematic exclusion of Muslim women and veiled women, especially from the labor, is also a way to I would say affaiblir, to weaken any possibility of a working class that is diverse to counter these arguments. Most lately, after the Charlie Hebdo's attacks, you have also a trade unionist who's been very, very active in his factory. He's been attacked because he said he was supposed to have said that I'm not for Charlie. So he's been attacked on the basis that he's Muslim, so he's against that, and he's a CGT worker, and the inability of the trade union back in the time, the CGT at the time, to support him weakened also its local section. So what can I say is that, well, situation in the trade union has changed a little bit. There is a radicalization also among them, and it was very important to tackle on the ideological aspects of racism, the fact that it's attacking a part of the working class, but also weakening the general movements. What can I say is that, yes, there's been some autonomous answers, like we only have to rely on ourselves as non-white people, we just have to self-organize. But the reality is that when you have movements are a test. When you have Nuit debout movements, like when people gather in places, you can't just stay at your side and say we are staying just between ourselves because we are oppressed. You have to build strategic bridges to prove to be effective. And part of the autonomous movement, anti-racist autonomous movement, have failed to grapple the political issues that's been raised globally, and they are mostly seen as, I would say, elitist intellectuals, I think, who have little importance on the ground. On the other side, on the recent years, through the emergence of anti-violence, anti-police violence campaigns, started a strategy of reuniting the left around anti-racist issues, around the fact that the authoritarianist laws are being heavy on everyone, and people from the banlieue and children of migrants were the first targets. And thanks to the movement Gilets Jaunes, collectives, anti-police violence collective, put forward that issue. So the question is not just having pure anti-racist political activity. Because when you have a movement happening, you have to ask those movements happening, those radical movements happening within the working class, you have to tell them that that racism is key if you want an effective results. And people from the banlieue are the first ones to have experienced police violence. May I talk about the 2005 banlieue revolts? The banlieue revolts was clearly a way to respond socially to a situation, but it's been marginalized under racist and culturalist justifications to put them aside. Colonial law was also reactivated to answer the 2005 revolt, and now there is. But at the same time, those revolts was kind of previewing what's the repression that is happening on a more global scale. The fact that many Gilets jaunes people were injured, that they are raising questions against police violence, that the state has been attacking them very concretely, really helped anti-racists to say, look, this is how the state looks like, and this is why we should unite together. Revolts back in 2005 was not just a matter of people just coming here to destroy, just to destroy. We share the same social anger. And it was notable to see that one of the key members of the Gilets jaunes, Éric Drouet, also acknowledged the fact that people who suffer from racism and 2005 banlieue revolt were at the forefront of class struggle in some sense, and that the Gilets jaunes in general should learn from the people from the banlieue. So when we talk about, this is my conclusion, bringing together people from different backgrounds, creating a new class culture, it doesn't mean that that we should deny the very specific experience that people who suffer from racism bring. It doesn't mean that we all go together, that we say working class, that we deny the variety, the diversity of identities and political experiences that exist. So building convergence des luttes, what we say in French, bringing together several struggles means also acknowledging the fact that the different level of class consciousness could feed one another.
So I'm very pleased to welcome Weyman. He's a long-standing campaigner of anti-racism and a socialist. He's a contributor to both Say It Loud, Marxism and Fight for Liberation, and Tell It Like It Is. He's also a member of the Central Committee for the Socialist Workers' Party and also joint convener of Stand Up to Racism London.
There's a lot of things, Dan. There's a lot of things I'm supposed to do, right? But I'm going to start off by saying that Marx said that philosophers interpret the world in different ways. The point, however, is to change it. And this is, when I listened to the discussion today, and Lenin argued something else. He said, without revolutionary theory, you can't have revolutionary activity. And the two things today, I think, are part of what we're discussing. And in order to understand that, when Alex explained the kernel, the development of capitalism and the link between racism and the link between exploitation, I think is a vital question. The discussion from France that has just taken place has been about how, without this revolutionary understanding of oppression, how you experience the world and how the power is in order to change it, you actually lose direction. And it's not just a minor question. If we think about what the debate is going to be around the European elections, for the first time since Auschwitz, we have parties that have developed that say they want to repeat the Holocaust. They do it in different ways. We also have racist populist parties. Without a Marxist analysis to explain it, you either end up being in despair, or you end up with another thing, is actually you have questions of resistance. The opening part, that Esme spoke today talked about how you experience capitalism, how you experience it as an identity. Benedict Anderson talked about imagined communities, that you imagine what your communities are. And Alex has just explained that the necessity of an ideology to explain the system is built as part of it, and about how that's changed and how that's developed. And it's not just a minor question. And I want to introduce a question of Leon Trotsky on the theory of the United Front and the theory of understanding fascism. If we look in this room, there are probably more people in this room that understood that theory than in 1930s inside Germany. And it's not that theory that explained the nature of a united front, that you need to unite in a specific way without dropping the question of opposition of capitalism, led partly to the defeat of the left in terms of the far right. The discussion we're having today is how we bring those things together. And I'm brought by, at the beginning of this discussion, there was a whole discussion about how Marx was Eurocentric. He didn't really understand. And really, I think that's because I said in one of the meetings, it's because people haven't read Marx. When Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, capitalism only developed essentially in Britain and bits of Belgium. And that part is uneven even in this country. But what he was focused on was this question about what was the drive behind the capitalist system? And why is this important? Because at the moment, when you talk about modern theorists of how people experience racism and oppose it, and we stand with the oppressed, by the way. Marx stood with the oppressed. Engels painted his house in Irish colours. Do you know what I mean? I think that we stand with the oppressed. But the point is to explain the question of power. The ideologies at the moment say that power is diverse, is put forward. Modern theorists, they borrow from Dahl, don't they? That power is dispersed in society. I think the key thing about Marxism is that it began to understand where the power of the ruling class comes from and what they say. Otherwise, you can't explain the idiocy that we're faced with. Boris Johnson. How do you explain Boris Johnson? Do you mean, people just say it's just because of the way he is. He's just like that. He's an idiot. He's a buffoon. He's whatever it is. But he's likely to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, and it will have profound implications about what happens around Brexit, what happens around it. If you don't understand it, you actually just look at the superficial things. His identity, his accent, his background. But actually what you have to understand is his role within global capitalism, the world that Britain is playing. I mean, who else would talk about the road to Mandalay in 1891 when he's trying to sell things to the Singaporeans and not understand its implications? Quoting to Rudyard Kipling and referring to imperialism isn't a very good way of selling things to people in terms of that. But that's aside. I mean, sorry, I'm going off, right? But the point is, right, actually, if you don't understand Gramsci's theory of hegemony and how a ruling class can lose its way, when you listen to Boris Johnson, he talks about 1891. He forgets that we live in 2019. That it's not possible to send a gunboat down the Yangtze River and automatically tell people what to buy. In other words, if you have Marx, you can understand the growth of global capitalism to the way it is today. You can understand the wars that take place. You can understand the ideologies that describe and do that. And more importantly, you can resist. And it's important that we talk about, I think, that's one of the part of this discussion is, one of the things that's happened with identity is the rich tradition of identity that's been associated with the Marxist tradition. C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins. George Padmore, the African liberation. Nyerere. We could go on and on about this experience. But part of that experience is the debate once I had with a man called Bobby Seale in Brixton. And I asked him, why did the Black Panthers not achieve liberation? And he said that we read Chairman Mao and we thought the power in society came from the peasants and the people on the block. And if you read what's been discussed here, it's a question of the difference between the collection experience. The collection experience of capitalism is very different. You can be black, Indian, Muslim, the change in nature, depending upon wars, how it can change. You have a collection of experience. The point of Marxism is to talk about the collective power, how you begin to put that into place, and also how you give an ideological lead to that. And that does matter. It does matter if you think that power comes from collection, your experience of oppression, rather than the question about how that oppression is right to fight against it. My personal experience is I was involved in 3 riots. It's brilliant to see the police run, but the problem is that they come back with the state the following day, knock on your door, show you a picture of yourself and arrest you. right? The question is about how do you resist that in a practical way. Lenin showed us the nature between state and revolution and how the state works. And what is that connection between that and the oppressed? I think that we've got to find our way back to 1917. I think it's one of the most brilliant parts of the reading is when you think about Leon Trotsky, you think about the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, what's amazing is how many of them are actually Jewish. And when you think about anti-Semitism in Europe, about it being a pernicious racism, then what you're able to do is understand that there's certain points in which it's true that you face racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, but what are the points at which those things are broken? Marx said, where the chains are forged are the best places in order to break the nature of capitalism. We have an analysis that explains how to do that, but at the same time, our experience is very varied and different. And I think that one of the things that's come out, there's an article by Tony Cliff about the experience of the Jewish community in the face of anti-racism. And he makes this point about how Marxism has developed its theory, but he also talks about how at the high points of struggle is when you actually see the working class as a universal class. I mean, often what people say to us is that you go and find somebody working class and you ask them, how is it today? How do you feel? What does it mean? And actually, I think what Marxism does is explain the ideological nature of how capitalists control society and interlink that between people's individual experiences, but how they change that when they're in a collective struggle. So it's during the French Revolution that you start to see that Jewish people start to develop rights. It's in the aftermath of the American Civil War, in that Gates book on Stony Road that Alex referred to. He talks about Du Bois talks about the second Reconstruction. It's out of this semi-revolutionary war that takes place that black people start to get rights. It's after 1968 that you start to talk about civil rights. Without 1968, without the struggles of people like Martin Luther King, then you would not have had Obama. But again, we see the limitations of the question of just the question of identity as being a way forward. In the 21st century, we face W. Du Bois said that the question of the 20th century was the question about the colour bar, about how liberation from Africa and the rest of it would raise that question, and then what would be the answer. The question of the 21st century is how you link all those things together to talk about making sure that the midnight of the century, the Holocaust, Auschwitz, doesn't become revisited on us. The debate we're having today isn't just a theoretical debate. We have to untangle all these things, not in order to ignore the oppressed, because the oppressed have been there for hundreds of years. The question is, how do you unleash both the potential of the oppressed and why Marxism is a better way of being able to explain this? And I think there's been a growth of massive books. I'm trying to, a massive growth of books that understand and explain oppression, but move away from any kind of class notion of it. And what's been discussed inside this school is not a class reductionism, as what people have said. It's a reassertion of what Marx began in the question of capital. And I end up in this. When people talk about the working class, they forget that 1.9 billion people are in the working class. And if you're talking about ethnic origin of the working class, actually the majority of the working class is actually non-white. That's the truth of it. So the idea that that potential can only be expressed if it expresses itself as an internationalist universal movement. And also if we politically understand what we've got to do. And I think that's rooted also in another political tradition of understanding those divisions and putting that inside our organisation. I'm proud to be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, but actually I think part of that has been a breakthrough of being putting that into practice. You watched, as a kid, a school teacher from the SWP say, I'll walk you to school. I understand Marx, but you have to go to school. And the National Front are trying to stop you, so I'll join hands with you. And actually, what you saw the defeat of the National Front. You saw the defeat of the British National Party. You saw these things and the application of both theory and practice and how it began to change things. And I think what we've discussed today is the beginning of part of that. And we've fleshed out many of those things in terms of the stage that we stand on. But I think that now what we face is a development of capitalism that's led to a universal change in terms of 1.9 billion workers, but also a mass confusion on the left. And I'd lay at this one thing. There's a man called Richard Wright, and he wrote a book called The God That Failed. And he said that the oppressed face a problem, that the rise of Stalinism, the question that you removed the agency of change as being the working class and made it other agencies. Nationalism was a major problem. He wrote a book called The God That Failed. I don't believe it was a God that failed, but I think it was a break in tradition that happened. And we have to find our way back to 1917, the liberation that led to Trotsky being the leader of the Soviet, a Jewish person at a time when there were a country that was dominated by anti-Semitism and racism. If they could break that, then that potential on a global basis is a lesson to all of us. It gives us the potential for a real change. And I think that's what we have to start to reach back to. We have to remember our theory as a guide to action, but we also have to apply that in today's society. And we've got a chance to do that. So I think the discussion we're having today about International Socialism Journal is a question about making sure that the right don't get into dominate and actually present an alternative argument about human liberation. Marxism is the theory of proletarian revolution, but it's also the question of human liberation. It's talking about doing away with racism. It's talking about doing away with sexism and homophobia. It's that universal theory that we have to try and rescue and put in its way. We have that task in front of us, and today has been one of a major stepping stone, and I'm proud to speak here.